Good evening, everyone. My name is Robin Considine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this May Newcastle Institute event. As many of you know, Newcastle has been a place of learning and sharing of ideas for thousands of years. We're proud with the Newcastle Institute to continue that tradition, albeit in this virtual space still at this time. We pay our respects to the Awabakal people and the Worimi people, the original custodians of this land, to elders past and present and also of the future. And we thank all the people who have made Newcastle a place where we can continue to explore and discover new ways of thinking, doing and being. The Newcastle Institute was formed in 2004 to promote rational discussion about diverse ideas. And tonight we're looking at discussing priorities for Newcastle and the Hunter from a range of perspectives from our panel members who are working on priorities in our region, and also one of our panellists who was informed by research in her local area will contribute perspectives about that region and from her research. For attendees on Zoom, please use the Q&A function to post any questions that you have. And for those watching on Facebook, please comment on the live stream questions you wish to be passed on to the panel. We may not be able to get to all questions, but we'll try and do as many as we can. So it's my pleasure and quite timely, I think, given the budget last night, to introduce the panel. We know that Newcastle's at a critical stage, Newcastle and the Hunter at a critical stage of their development, a transitional phase characterised by regional growth, reduced global demand for coal, and opportunities for new industries by changing energy sources and diversification into our region. We've faced this transition before with the closure of BHP and potential doom, which never eventuated, resulting from the lost employment. Yet this major transition from BHP resulted in growth and revitalisation of this once dominant steel city. A key question now for government, businesses, scientists, and in particular our community is how we maximise the opportunities and ensure these are shared across the region. Our three panellists will present different perspectives on lessons learned and how to position Newcastle and the Hunter as a vibrant, dynamic region for the future. Alice Thompson, who is CEO of the Committee for the Hunter, and for members, you may remember that a couple of years ago we had the Chair Richard Anasich presenting on the Committee for the Hunter, is one of our panellists. Alice is a widely regarded leader in public policy with a focus on infrastructure, industry development and attraction, urban planning and regional development. Her career spans public and private sectors, such as the national lead on cities and regions with global firm KPMG, and senior advisors on cities and infrastructure to former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Through her career, Alice has championed new approaches to regional development, such as the Western Sydney City Deal, a partnership, and I think we'll hear that word a bit tonight, across all levels of government in a long-term plan for jobs, skills, training, international investment, better transport and livability. In her role as Committee for the Hunter, Alice advocates at a strategic level for our region. In this capacity, she'll focus on partnering with government and business to build investment and synergies between capital and community infrastructure for Newcastle and the Hunter. So thank you, Alice, and welcome. Warwick Jordan is born and bred in the Hunter Valley. He has particular experience in issues involving complex change process and with a wide variety of stakeholders. He's passionate about ensuring workers in the Hunter Valley have access to a full range of opportunities available in the region. As coordinator of the Hunter Jobs Alliance, Warwick aims for a future in our region with full employment, good union jobs, a thriving and healthy living environment, and an equitable society with a stable climate and renewable prosperity. Thanks, Warwick, for your time tonight as well. Gabrielle Chan is another of our panellists tonight. Gabrielle was a journalist for more than 30 years, or she has been, sorry, she's still working as a journalist. She's been a political journalist and and politics blogger at The Guardian since 2013. Prior to that, she worked at The Australian, the ABC Radio, the Daily Telegraph, in local newspapers and politics. Gabriel's written and edited a number of books. Gabriel is the daughter of a Singaporean migrant and moved from the Canberra Press Gallery to marry a sheep and wheat farmer in 1996. Interestingly, the same year Pauline Hanson was first elected to the federal parliament. She noticed in that local community the economic and cultural divide between the city and the country, the differences in political culture, and the yawning gap between parliament and small town life. So in September 2017, Gabriel swapped interviews with politicians to interviews with ordinary people on her main street to discover why they think politics has moved so far away from their lives. The result is a book, Rusted Off, Why Country Australia is Fed Up. In this process, Gabriel draws conclusions about the current state of our rural political representation, the gap between city and country, and how to bridge it, and will bring interesting perspectives on not just the priorities for the hunter, but how we bring the region along. So welcome, panellists. Given the timing of this event with last night's budget, I wonder if we could just take a couple of minutes to talk about the hunter-specific announcements, just briefly the main announcements for the hunter, and perhaps examples of a couple of others that are not specific to the hunter, but provide opportunities for the hunter. So I'll ask Alice to do that.
Thank you, Robin. So everyone would have heard and seen splashed across the news that we got 66 million for the Newcastle Airport runway upgrade. So this has been a project that the committee has advocated really hard on. That's because when you're looking at assets in a regional community, your two main ones around industry and jobs, like your big bang on ones are the international gateways. So you are looking at airports, you're looking at ports, and we happen to have both. So I think that puts us in a great position. That funding allows us to get on with the project and the tourism and the trade opportunities that it brings. The hunter defence industry is also another industry of comparative advantage in our region. They're boosted by the further investment in Williamtown and the Singleton Army Base. There was a range of programs around mental health, youth unemployment, skills and training. And these were all issues that have been raised by the kids who are joining the committee as part of our youth committee for the hunter. So we meet for the first time next week, opportunity to have a look at those opportunities, discuss what it means and how we could access some of those funds. There was a top up to the Building Better Regions, which is a competitive grant fund program available to councils and their partners. So that's a competitive fund available for our councils to get some funding for community and local infrastructure. What we might have liked to have seen some more of, social and crisis housing has been something that, again, a number of a consortium of committee members continues to advocate at the state and the federal level. Further support for the university sector. We've seen how, again, our other anchor institution, the university, has been absolutely smashed in their revenues because of the loss of international students and other COVID-related impacts. As a result, they've had to go back to their books and the STEM transformation hub has been paused. Now, this is exactly the kind of investment in our people, in our skills and training that will help recover the region from the impacts of COVID, but also keep us competitive in the future. And we certainly feel that financial support to the university, to the sector in general, will help provide more capacity for the university to get on with this important project. Out of all of this, we're going to continue to advocate not for ad hoc projects, we will talk about this later as we go through the session, but really a more strategic approach to investment, and that we know that you'll get better outcomes from existing funds if they're delivered as part of an integrated plan to diversify the region's economy. There wasn't a decision on Kurri Kurri. I think we're all looking for certainty on this. There is concern about seeking certainty around dispatchable electricity, but I think we also want to understand how this fits in with our mix and the unique energy demand profile for the region, and particularly a rapid shift to clean energy economy. I would say in summary though, as an advocate, the easy thing for us to do is to keep asking for more, and that's actually what some advocates only do. We could ask more and more, but I actually look at this and I think that we have the scale and the level of funding in the Hunter across all three levels of government is significant, and it's without precedent. So funding is actually no longer the barrier or the limit to the region getting ahead. So it's really up to the region now, I think, with these kind of anchor investments or seed funding, if that's what we might call them. It's up to us to have a look at these projects and to see how we can leverage this significant public spend to encourage more of the private sector investment into the Hunter to grow this down payment. Now, that generally does happen naturally. We can be passive, or we could actually be really proactive and have a look at them, see how they relate to each other, and really go hunting with purpose to pull in that private sector investment, because as a region, we've got a lot, but we're competing with other regions around Australia and the rest of the world. I think it's also up to the communities and businesses and the councils of the region to take advantage of all the grant opportunities and the incentives, and to put their best foot forward in applications to make sure that they can bring a fair share of these funds into the region. And the committee is always here to provide support in these applications. I've sat on the other side of the fence, setting up the guidelines and assessing applications. But as I said, I think there's a lot there. It's up to us to now have a look at that, pick it up, and really multiply the kind of investments and benefits that come from these projects.
Thanks, Alice. And I think we'll focus a bit tonight on how we can do that as well. So it's not just the wanting to do it, it's how we can actually do it in from a strategic sense, but also how we as community members can help in that way. I want to talk a little bit about sort of some lessons that have been learnt from the past. As I said in our introduction, there's been past transitions both in Newcastle and the Hunter, with probably the most significant recent one, the BHP, the loss of the BHP, but there's been others in other regions. And I wonder, firstly, you, Warwick, what you think are the lessons that can be learnt from past transitions that can contribute to solutions for the transition we're really facing now in Newcastle and the Hunter. And then I might ask Gabriel to comment on that, of some of the lessons from her research that she's learnt about regions and priorities.
Yeah, look, Robin, really good question. I think there's a really consistent set of understandings that are coming through, both through research, but also just the practical experience of people on the ground. And it really has advanced quite a bit, I'd say, over the last 30 years or so, as far as the level of understanding. But, you know, look, we know the basics. Get started as early as possible. Make sure you're including local people in decision making. Go through the list of things that we know work in terms of supporting workers, attracting investment, land use planning, public investment, all of those things. But essentially, you need to work through the list in a region and see what works. And you also need a substantial amount of usually public investment to support that. So we know the top line stuff, but oftentimes the challenge around these changes is implementing it on the ground. Essentially, what we're trying to do is redirect the forces of capital and economic change in a way that minimises the harms on the community and maximises the opportunity to take new opportunities and growth opportunities. And that's a really difficult thing to do. It takes a bit of trial and error. I think reflecting on the local experience, and look, there'll be people on tonight who are much closer to some of those things that have happened in the past than I have been. But I would say a reflection is the Hunter's been quite good at pulling together in times of crisis, you know, from the 55 floods to what happened with the BHP cuts in the early 80s through to closure, even some of the responses to the mining downturn. So we tend to do crisis pretty well, where we pull together, make best efforts, you know, try and create new jobs, support people through. It's never perfect, but we do seem to get better at coordinating and working together. The challenge now, I think, is the issues we're facing. They're really big, long run challenges. They're slow burn. You need to get started early, and there's just a whole bunch of psychological or social or economic reasons why it's hard to wrap your head around something that is uncertain in its timeline and is not impacting the community right now, but might soon. And I think the history of looking at structural adjustment or regional change or transitions is that it's littered with regions that probably clocked that there was a bit of an issue, but essentially didn't act until it was time to call the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And I think the strong narrative, and I think the advantage we have in the Hunter is that we are starting to try and find our way through to have a conversation about changes that will be a bit slower burn and unpredictable. And the more we can have that conversation and get started, the better shape we're going to be in.
Thanks, Warwick, because we're really not at that crisis point at the moment, are we? And we want to position ourselves so that we can plan and act in consideration of what will be happening in the future instead of an emergency response when industries close down.
And look, you can. It's a good observation. You can see the challenges in it. Essentially, we have a really difficult political challenge in that we've seen in our region the conversation has gone a bit sideways as far as being able to talk about some of those economic realities and what might happen and what we could do to get ahead of it. And so finding a way to carve out some space to have a conversation is really important and challenging, at the same time as actually working out how to deal with some of those really difficult economic realities that will impact people and impact our prospects for the future. So they're twin challenges, and we've got to find a way through both of them.
Yeah. Gabriel, Warwick just touched on some of the, I guess, the politicisation and the differences between politicians' perspectives of, what the problems are in the region and where we can go, to what the community is saying. What are some of the lessons that you've learned in the conversations you've had with your local community and the priorities that they see? Hang on, you're on mute.
I'd probably start by describing my community, which is quite different to Newcastle and the Hunter region. It's primarily a farming region. My town is a small town, 2,000 people. The region is reasonably close to Canberra. Commuters, but it has gone through sort of ups and downs, and the town itself of Harden was a railway town, so it was a big government jobs town. When I came here in 95, 96, there was a constant focus on the big employer. Everyone wanted to find the next big employer that was going to replace the railways, which was the major employer in town, to have bulk paychecks into the town and into the region. And it took a lot of discussion around how to change the culture and change the expectations in the town, that perhaps one or two big employers in a little town like ours wasn't a great way to go. We'd see grants come and go for things like abattoirs that would then close down as the market turned, and we'd drop a class at the local school. So I think it sparked a bigger conversation about the need for complexity in the local economy, the need for lots of small to medium, but also hopefully large employers that created that economic diversity, so that the rug wasn't pulled out when big employers went south. And so that was one lesson, that the tension between the local and the national or the state leaders in terms of politicians was always a sort of mismatch of what the priorities were, what the policies that were foisted upon places without a consideration of what that place was or what the people in that place wanted. And And though there were lots of consultation processes by people coming in, particularly before elections, there was almost this consultation fatigue that set in. Oh, I went to that, last time and nothing happened. They didn't listen to what we said. They didn't listen to our priorities. So I think there's the organisations that the three of you represent are amazing kind of examples of something that's coming, from the region itself, and that has, I think, would have an incredible strategic capacity to put together both the bones of a local plan, but also bring together some of the stakeholders. And that's part of the problem with politics. We see this kind of descent into culture wars about whether you're a worker or an employer, or left or right, or minor or greenie, and it just gets us nowhere. So I think that strategic plan is really important. And if there's one thing I've learned in politics, just watching it over the years, it's that over the last 3 decades, we've had this kind of deregulation, opening up of the economy that brought with it lots of advantages, but it also brought lots of losers in that process. And so we've allowed this debate to kind of consider the market default as a natural element of the economy, like it's this kind of natural system that grows up the way that any natural system does. And I think what we've seen in terms of economic reform is really a kind of re-regulation. We still have rules. We're not completely deregulated. The rules have just changed. And so I think for local communities like mine and perhaps yours, we really want to concentrate on getting a strategic plan from the local level so that we can match it up with policy and maybe knock the rough edges off any national policy that is imposed on us. So that as soon as a government, state or federal, local even, comes and says, we want to do this, we can say, well, these are the reasons why maybe that won't work, or we could tweak it slightly to better align it with local priorities. Because, a default, a sort of vacuum in strategic policy creates outcomes as much as a strategic policy creates outcomes. Mm-hmm. So you can have no policy and things will happen, but you can have your own strategic policy and hopefully it guides you along that path to where you want to go.
Alice, did you want to comment on?
Yeah, so I've actually been the fireman that has come in several times when the major industry has fallen out of a town. And I think there's some perspective that's worthwhile looking, which does drive an urgent need to have that plan really here for the hunter. So normally it is one employer, and we're talking really multiple employers, and also we've got the coal mining sector as well as the coal-fired generation sector, and the workers are different across these and their needs. So what happens normally when a business closes? So often it comes at pretty politically inopportune times. So what you're in there too late, and you're designing essentially a package. Often the ones that I've seen and been early, it's been quite unilateral. So it's been the federal government, so they haven't sought to engage the state government, which is often of a different persuasion. So there's all, who wants to take the lead here and get the credit for that. But the packages pretty much consist of, it depends on if the employer is insolvent and whether there are outstanding worker wages and entitlements. And there is a mechanism sitting at the federal government to kick in and to help compensate and make sure people can still live their lives and put food on the table in that process. They'll often have a worker placement element to it, not a reskilling, but a worker placement. So again, it's already too late in the piece. You're dealing with people who are unemployed and you're trying to find them a job elsewhere. Infrastructure is always a really critical one, and that's one of the areas that's the most expensive in our budget in some ways in terms of capital, but it's the one that's most politicised. It's the area that could probably do with being the least politicised, quite frankly. But that kind of infrastructure, I mean, if I look at La Trobe, and that consisted of some projects that were just basically picked from above and announced, but there was also something called the Regional Jobs and Investment package or project, which was also kind of local community infrastructure. It was meant to be there it was targeted to help businesses who were part of the supply chains to, you know, do something or to get some contracts through some local construction work. But in reality, how did that play out? Well, there was a panel, which was a backbench and his mates that he got to hand choose for the region. I will say he, because that's the, you know, that's what the gender looks like, balance looks like. So again, really rife, not part of any plan or strategic view, but who gets what. So we know that it's too little and it is too late. But I think we do sit here and I hear it frequently, you know, we need a plan, we need a plan. Can someone take leadership for the plan? And I think that level of inertia is somewhat explained quite objectively through, well, there is politics. We can certainly see in the upper Hunter that that candidates think that they will lose votes on account of it. So they're reticent to really tackle that issue. Politics also tends to work in the binary. So it does have that unfortunate effect of kind of seeking to divide, to generate a fear of change, and back in those corners, it doesn't seek to unite communities under a vision of a better future and embrace it with all the complexity and the warts that kind of brings. But the Hunter region is probably one of the most fragmented in terms of the structures of governance and government that I've experienced. You know, it's pretty close to the Sydney metropolitan area. We've got 10 councils, we've got a number of state, federal electorate seats, and the way that plays is, you know, you could be for example, this has happened, the committee has fought for a piece of infrastructure that might be in one electorate but provides benefits to the whole region, and yet you won't have the members in, you know, whose project it's not in their boundary sticking up, even though their populations will certainly benefit from it. We have marginally less federal electorates and they're a little bit removed. They don't really have the representation on the ground here. We've got a state planning system that divides itself into the upper Hunter and the lower Hunter. And when you're dealing with such a complex issue like structural adjustment, wrong geography. You need to have all of your best team at the table and understand the kind of synergies. We've got the economic development strategies, which is one of the state's primary vehicles for economic development, and it cuts every way which across this boundary. So I look at that and say, if we put our hand up and say we need a plan, can someone take the lead? There actually really is no logical leader, because we know that plan needs to involve all three levels of government, agencies across any level of government, and of course partnerships between communities, the private sector and governments. So who's going to lead? I say we need to pick up the mantle in that vacuum.
Great, it's an interesting perspective, and we're going to talk about sort of the capital infrastructure and priorities, but also ensuring that there's also opportunities for social and community infrastructure as well as environmental. Alice, you've mentioned the importance of the synergies between some of the capital infrastructure projects. We've had in the past, and other regions had, a series of discrete infrastructure projects. They're done and they're finished, and not necessarily things come out as a result of them. So how do you think that we can maximise the synergies between these series of infrastructure projects that have either been announced or will be announced, so that we can get outcomes in terms of investment, business growth, but also training, apprenticeships, you know, social development opportunities? How does that occur when there's a fairly siloed approach to these projects?
So the siloed approach is the norm. I mean, and I spent some of my career in Infrastructure Australia, which was established essentially to provide a more strategic approach to national infrastructure priorities and look at how they could leverage each other. So look, there really is a problem there. I think it is about, we do have a burning platform here. It is structural adjustment of quite a large scale. It's not an insignificant scale. And that kind of provides the bit of the light on the hill. So we need to identify, okay, what does success look like? And I don't see that anything that we've got really around the region suggests what those goalposts could be. So for example, we have an Upper Hunter diversification plan, which is great. It's got the right people sitting around the table and having discussions, but it is confined to just 2 local government areas. But if I was to review it, it would be around outputs. Did they meet? Did they put their website up? Did they do this? As opposed to what does success in this adjustment look like? And to me, that's looking at the level of jobs that are currently in the mining and energy. How do we actually increase that number within our region? How do we increase the level of economic contribution that those sectors currently provide? How do we do all of that, grow the economy and the jobs while doing our bit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and meet our net zero target? How do we do that and make sure that there's parity in outcomes across our region, across different population groups as well? And also, I think the Hunter has a really proud history, or we're still in it, in energy. I think that's part of our contribution, saying how do we maintain the level of generation capacity for the whole of Australia? And if not increase that. So what I'm saying essentially is a plan, and if you set those goalposts, then you can start to see how all the bits in the system might feed in and encourage that. So you're looking at capital, you're looking at land use planning, you're looking at governance, you're looking at regulation, you're also looking at planning, and you're seeing how a decision might impact upon that goal or not, but also how does one decision in one portfolio or area, how might that kind of leverage or strengthen or multiply the benefits if you do this in coordination or collaboratively with others? That's what a plan looks like to me. And I think it's really, that's the kind of framework through which we can start thinking about the kind of infrastructure investments which will support that. That is local and community level infrastructure, making everyone's life better. While we do that, pretty quickly, easy, providing those local jobs, those local contracts as well. But particularly, it is about those massive anchor. We call it an anchor because everything pivots from that. That is things like the port containerisation. It is the airport. It is investment in our people, in our knowledge and capacity in the university. And we know that if we hit those, that it will have this knock-on effect throughout the entire regional economy and beyond, and that's what makes them priorities. So essentially, we don't know how to prioritise because we haven't put the light on the hill.
Yeah, I guess, Warwick, from that perspective, that they are potentially anchor projects, but unless we as a region sort of say we want them to be anchor projects, but we want the links between all these things identified and acted upon, it may not happen. We'll end up with an anchor project, but it may not be attached to other things in our community. How do you think we can get those links or synergies?
Yeah, look, a couple of points there. And this is a bit cheeky, but I'm going to throw a quote at you that maybe some people will recognise. The role of strong and effective leadership in economic development should not be underestimated. There is a need for a body to bring together all of the economic development organisations in the Valley, the councils, government departments and community groups. Our greatest need is for a peak body defining regional goals. So that was from an organisation that some of the folks at home will be familiar with, the Common Purpose Group, which was pulled together after the announcement of the steelworks closure. And that was directly from a job summit that was held at the time. And so I think to Gabrielle's point in terms of, you do get a little bit of community fatigue around these issues, is something that's been identified for a long time. But I think in terms of a prescription for making use of investments in infrastructure or other things, I think you can do a lot worse than having an organisation that's representative across the region and has a specific job to be able to respond to these kind of economic challenges. So I think that's one way. The other thing I'd say is that I don't necessarily the Hunter. We will get infrastructure investments from government sometimes. We will lose out at other times. Like every other region, we always want our fair share or more of it. And sometimes things come our way and sometimes things don't. Something that really stuck with me from a couple of years ago at a Regional Australia Institute conference that I think Gabrielle actually spoke at as well. There's an academic from the University of South Australia called Andrew Beer, who's quite well known around these regional development circles. And he's essentially got a view that in Australia, we just spend on infrastructure in response to these type of challenges. But the other couple of parts of the picture are really investing around skills and human capital, and also our best efforts to make sure that we can try and attract some of that financial capital and investment. And in Australia, we tend to just go to the hard infrastructure. Yes, it's very, very important, but it's also a bit more risk-free from a political point of view. There's more ribbons to cut. It's more tangible for the community in terms of that compared to, some of the more difficult investment attraction activities or trying to get reskilling to work in a community, because that takes a long time. So I'd say in terms of, there'll be other people better qualified than me who could give you a view on how to maximise the value out of specific infrastructure investments and tying them together. But I'd say part of the need here is for the community and people who are focused on these issues to put their hand up and say, look, we appreciate those kind of big investments in infrastructure. At the same time, there's probably some really efficient investments in things like skills and in things like investment attraction and capital provision and grants and so on that can go a really long way. And when we see those things done, whether it's Job Trainer, it was good to see that extended in the budget. Again, last night, where you've got more money for skills, or it's things even like the Hunter Advantage Fund that occurred through the BHP era, where you get some efficient outcomes in terms of job creation. We do need to be pushing, I think, on those things as well as on the hard infrastructure outcomes.
I guess I want to make it concrete here. So, for example, if you had the airport widening, how will that infrastructure project ensure, one, that they take all the opportunities for the apprenticeship announcement that has occurred? How will they ensure that the mental health of their workers and the families of those workers, how do they ensure that any airport redesign takes into account the needs of the ageing population? It's not just getting the synergies, and how do they ensure that they're using green energy? It's sort of that cross-link between those sort of things that I'd like to sort of understand, how we get that sort of across infrastructure and social program alignment.
Look, I think just briefly that there have been, from what I understand, and there'll be others who are closer to the action, but there have been some improvements in relation to, for example, tier one contractors being required to use procurement to be able to put on more apprentices or look after people who have disadvantage in the community to give them opportunities. Can more be done? Absolutely. One of the things that I'm quite interested in, Alice or Gabrielle might have a view on this. I look at things like the airport expansion. It's a great opportunity for us. But it's beyond an opportunity to get some tourists in and for us to have more opportunities to go elsewhere. I look at places like Toowoomba and the Wellcamp Airport that they've created up there, which was created to be able to support some of their agricultural investments and so on. I know it's a different region, it's a different place, but I know there are those kind of value-add opportunities here, and I think that's the type of thing that we should be looking to maximise the value.
Perhaps I could give an illustration of this, which I think also calls into question if it's happening right now and supported by the current state and federal government, why can't they do that here? So out in Western Sydney, I was involved in the city deal and also the federal government approach to the Badgerys Creek, which had been sitting there for 50 years. So I'm really proud to have been a part of being able to tip that over. But what happened was a conversation in government that said, why are we building this airport? Are we doing this to create additional aviation space in the Sydney Basin? Because that actually is what its purpose. So we're questioning what its purpose was. And we went on a bit of a narrative that went something like, look, we can see that we've got 1 in 8 kids in Australia growing up in Western Sydney, and their parents can access less than 5% of the jobs across the entire metro area within 50 minutes of any mode of transport. So that's even in a car. So you have this latent and disconnected labour force and talent and people who just deserve opportunity. So the narrative then went, okay, you've got this massive investment that's going in there, and yet you've got this economic development issue. And keep in mind that that issue was only going to be exacerbated because they needed to absorb on current planning projections. Maybe that's changed a smidge with COVID, 1.5 million people by 2036. And what a waste. You know, this is of national interest when we're talking about productivity and jobs and employment and well-being of our communities. So basically, we were able to convince that you're not building this airport just because, and for the aviation space, this is your ability to do it. And then it completely changed the thinking around how you do it. How do you design it? What do you need to embed in your procurement, for example, as an opportunity? But it also went that if that is now your objective, oh, look, you need to work with councils, you need to work with state governments, you need to work with communities, because the objectives need actions and levers that sit in different levels of government. So that kind of parity was really galvanising, and it flicked on its tail really a process that was going to hand over that airport to the private sector. And in the end, government made a decision to hold on to that asset, a coalition government, who generally likes to privatise these assets, because they knew that they had certainty and a very strong lever to deliver on other objectives that they had across government. And that's what we need to do. I mean, Royk's right, it's not just a focus on capital infrastructure, it's human infrastructure. There's a range of initiatives, projects, things that need to be, that certainly need to be working together. But there is also, when we've got budgets are tight and you're building a hospital or you're building an airport, we can't just afford to build a functional building with all of that money. We need to look across other aspirations, issues, objectives that we have in government, across the economy, in life, and see how you can design a project that better delivers and talks to that, not just their portfolio minister, because you've got a bird in the hand and it's a really powerful one.
We had at our March event where we were talking about doing politics differently, Cathy McGowan and Andrew Lee as a couple of the panellists. And I think we talked about that one of Jacinda Ardern's comments, it was something like, you know, if you have, you know, you focus on economic indicators and it's a huge success economically, but the inequity gap is growing, well, there's not success, it's failure. So I wondered what you thought were the economic indicators of this transition. Sorry, the indicators, not the economic indicators. What do you see as the indicators for our region? And perhaps I'll ask you, Gabriel, what do you think are the indicators that you would think your community would value as success? Before I ask Alison and Warwick.
Well, little towns like mine always look at things like population. Is the regional migration still a thing? You know, we heard about all these stories of people moving to regional areas post-pandemic or during the pandemic. We look at population numbers. Firstly, we look at schools. You know, schools are a pretty good indicator. Health services, and I think probably here is where small towns are quite different to your regions. You know, you do get a sense on the main street of what the feeling is, you know, whether people feel like they have opportunities. So I would say those kind of social indicators, as well as obviously unemployment rates and all the economic figures that that people usually look at. And the other thing I look at is kids coming back, because migration out of town is a big deal, and fair enough, you know, people want to go and explore all the opportunities elsewhere and see something else. But are people coming back, you know, with their qualifications? Because often they have to go away. You've got a fantastic university and you've probably got much more available, but those sorts of things. But I just want to hark back to the last question too, and that is on, you know, the synergies between the infrastructures announcements that have been made. And in my next book, which is really on food, farming and climate, one of the things I look at in strategic policies is risk management. And I talk to some experts in risk, and they talk about really getting representatives. So Warwick's idea of a unified body may not be a permanent body, but it may be a body made up of people from all of your organisations and more that come in and really have a stake in whatever those priorities are that are made. And you know, there are always, from these broad ideas and discussions, going to come, I guess, subgroups, if you like, on things like health or education or skills training or hard infrastructure. And I wonder whether there can be some sort of kind of guerrilla groups, for want of a better word, that form to address an issue and take it back to that unified body and implant that in any strategic plan. Because I think, and you see this in federal government and state government, that there are the silos conversations, and the risk experts I talked to were talking about, you know, maybe you can get a deputy secretary or you know, someone not right at the top, but people coming together so that they're talking about similar problems. And so I think that, you know, that's a big question about how you get synergies between these big projects that you've had announced. I think it might be one way to go.
Warwick, do you have any views on the sorts of indicators that you think we should be looking at as a measure of success that actually bring together the social capital that we need, the equity capital, and as well as the capital infrastructure?
Yeah, look, you know, I think to some extent, you know, you got to think about what's the whole show about, right? We're trying to create an environment and a region where people can have access to opportunities that they can build a life around. And so I think to some extent, paying attention to some of those hard economic indicators around employment, around full and part-time employment, around what the picture looks like regionally, the data around disadvantage, those things are really important. I think something that is worth thinking about beyond that, in the Hunter, we're a very prosperous place, but we do have some diversity. Like, there are obviously parts of the valley that are more similar and have more similar challenges to what Gabrielle's talking about in terms of not wanting kids to leave town, having access to educational opportunity, having access to good, well-paid jobs. And we've been really fortunate and are really fortunate that those opportunities are there for people. The flip side of that, though, is then when you think about some of those other indicators, you know, we're close to the top of the list at a statewide level in terms of things like anxiety, smoking rates, obesity, and so on. And, you know, that's not casting any aspersions on anyone in the community, but it's just a reminder about, you know, what are we in this for? And so if we're creating economic opportunity and continuing to be able to create that for people. That's a real priority. But we also need to be thinking about what are the investments in terms of mental health or those other things. You know, we've seen a big debate recently about access to healthcare in the Upper Hunter. It's certainly a timely debate and an important one. I think we need to be prioritising those kind of issues and thinking about those kind of indicators.
Mm. We're sort of close to running out of time, but I wanted to finish up with a question which I think reflects some of the excitement about the opportunities, but also some of the concerns, I guess, that if these opportunities are realised, will Newcastle and the Hunter be recognisable in the future? And how will we ensure that the economic growth is balanced with a sustainable environment and the sense of the community that is an attraction for people that live here and want to return here or move here? How do we ensure that we recognise the place that we live in and it just doesn't go like some regional towns are complaining about, Gabriel, that there's too many people moving in and they don't recognise their local area? How do we ensure that happens?
Well, for me, I think it always comes back to how you design your own future. And if I've learnt anything in this latest research process, I've learnt that, you know, Australia's regional development history is one of pretty intense government decision-making and intervention. And none of these regions, particularly your own, have sprung out of nowhere. They were as a result of government decisions to base energy and other industries there, and they have provided cheap power and you know, labour and lives in a lot of cases to the rest of the state and the rest of the country. And so I think while we all aspire for our local regions to create our own plans, I think it's got to be done with some government input. And yes, they put the money in, but I would think governments would have to recognise that, you know, in order to realise any place's dream or fantasy about development, social and economic development, that it requires a little bit of assistance from government in terms of expertise or linkages or contacts, so that you can realise the goals that you're trying to seek. And I think the only way to create a place that is recognisable and that ticks all the boxes that community itself wants is by mapping out your own dream, but then really leveraging government expertise and support, as well as private sector expertise and support, in order to realise it. Because, I mean, it can't be done out of nowhere. It's got to, I think governments have a duty to follow on the thing they started, which is setting up these regions, setting up the industries for the wealth of the country, but then also following through to the next progression, to whatever that progression is that the community decides it wants to have.
Alice?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question. And look, I live in an old federation. This place has changed over time. They've filled in the veranda, they've added this, you know. So places are dynamic, they're never caught in time. And I would certainly say that what we're seeing played out in the Hunter region is actually some of the nostalgia is being used, it's being weaponised, and it's holding us back from really embracing the future. So there is change. The point is that we want everyone to be better off by it, not to fear, and be united under that vision. And I think what would be the worst change to see in this community is actually if you see the communities, the people not the infrastructure or the roads or the streets, which, you know, I do have to say some of the main streets really do need to be upgraded, and the footpaths to be more amenable and better for older people, and, you know, you name it. But I think what would be a tragedy is if communities are broken up because workers and families need to leave the region in order to find work because we didn't have a plan, and we didn't have a plan in time to help them adjust, find that job for their kids as well. We've got multiple generations of some families sitting within some of these industries. So I'm someone perhaps is a bit more relaxed about change, but it needs to be change for the better. But I fear without that kind of plan, and particularly, you know, what is places people to me. If we lose our people, that's very difficult to repair. That social capital, that sense of place and community and services that you get out of that as well, that will really change the nature.
Warwick, do you want to comment on that?
Oh, you know, look, it's one of the best places on earth to live and work and raise a family. And, you know, I think if other people are interested in coming here and being a part of that, then, you know, I'm sure we can work it out and make them feel welcome. I would second Gabrielle's point. I think it's really important to recognise, and hopefully things are swinging back around again, but we have really benefited from government intervention over time. You know, the steelworks was in part there because the government gave them a free patch of land. Tomago Aluminium is in, you know, fair measure there because the state government built them a power station at Araring. You know, we've had all of these interventions, and I think hopefully it's coming around again. It would have been really unfortunate, or will be really unfortunate, if that type of, you know, what some people call neoliberal approach, where governments are really hands-off, it is something we have to have happen to us while we're trying to deal with these big changes. And I think we should be creating expectations of government to do more. I do also think the point around retaining social cohesion is really important. And I think we need to be really honest with ourselves about the type of work that's available and the type of opportunities there for people. You know, not everyone in this region is going to have a degree. Not everyone's going to be, you know, an IT developer or, you know, working in renewable energy or whatever it might be. And I think we need to keep a really firm hand on how we support people who have aspirations to work in particular industries or do particular things or live particular ways that aren't necessarily shared by people who are making decisions or people in advocacy organisations like ours, if I'm perfectly honest. You know, I think we need to be able to recognise there's a diversity of aspirations out there in the community and support all of those in a non-paternalistic way. You know, we need to be in everybody's corner and we need to be listening to a lot of different people in the community.
Yeah. Gabrielle, we've just had a question from one of our members about the way in which that you've written about the way in which community can respond politically when they're ignored or disrespected. And Brad wanted to know, was there a tipping point at which your community said enough is enough and tried to take it into their own hands? You're muted.
My community has been pretty safe, both national and Liberal at various times at state and federal government. But in the electorates that I covered in politics that were moving towards more independent candidates, I mean, usually there is a spark or an issue that really fires people up. That said, you know, the classic example of Indi was a result of locals getting together and wanting more engagement with their local member. So doing the work of, you know, working out what the priorities were in the electorate and going along to the then member, Sophie Mirabella, and not getting an adequate response in their mind, and so organising after that. But often there's an issue or a personality. Tony Abbott was a case in point where obviously people in that electorate of Warringah had a strong feeling about that he wasn't serving that electorate, and there was a coalescing of things. I know recently I've watched a bit of change in my federal electorate, which is Riverina, and here there's a bit of a collection of issues that are ramping up, but whether it leads to opposition or a new candidate, it's a very, very big margin that anyone who ran would have to surmount. But there are issues that people are coalescing around, like climate change, women's issues, particularly following what we've seen in federal parliament. And I don't think it's any surprise that the government knows that, and which is why there was so much hurrah about, women's policies in the budget. But yeah, usually there is something that tips it over the edge, and how well it's organised and how long in advance is organised is a real is probably the thing that really points to whether communities can make a dent or not. Often there's a kind of brain snap. 6 months out, we're going to do this. Okay, let's go. Whereas the ones that have been more successful, I think, have been more organised early on. But it's all about options, right? It's political. It's the political market. It's competition,
Yep.
And I think local communities are best served by maximum competition.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to sum up some of the key messages, and you may want to add a couple, that I'm getting is that there's clearly a need for our community, our region, and I'm speaking broadly in terms of community members as well as business and government, taking a lead to determine their own future. And that involves a plan, but it needs to be a plan that can be actioned, not just sit on a shelf like many of them do. But it almost sounds that plan is best delivered by a group independent but partnering with government. Is that the sense? I mean, is that summing up of what you're saying, the key messages, do you think? Or
I would have. Okay.
Yeah, I would say that absolutely. And I really firmly believe and see that communities are ahead of government in terms of policy making. I think the political cycle has got so hard to expect governments to come up with bespoke policies for every region is really just not realistic. So I think determining your own future and then mustering the political forces in order to do that is definitely the way to go.
Warwick, do you want to?
Oh, look, I probably have a slightly different view. I think it's horses for courses in terms of what a particular regional environment looks like. And I have thought a bit. I definitely take Gabrielle's point around governments can't do bespoke policies for every region. At the same time, I think there are some regions where there is a good reason for putting in bespoke type policies, and I think facing big structural changes is one of those reasons. I think there's others, as far as if you have entrenched disadvantage or economic difficulty. I think there is also a case for more specific intervention. I do think there is a role for government to be able to. I think the ideal model, in our part of the world is very much around an organisation that has some independence from government, but has access to the policy-making capacity, the funding, and all the tools of government, but does have that local driver. I just think the scale of change that we're looking at, in a region with 600,000 people and gigantic export industries and so on, it's actually really hard for communities to have the expertise and the capacity and to find the dollars to be able to do it. So I think there is a middle ground there somewhere, which translates in different regions in different ways. But I think you have to create expectations of government that this is something they need to take seriously, because community can't do it all by themselves.
Yeah. It sounds, Alice, you might want to comment.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're going to be you're going to be very busy.
Well, I'll put another layer on it because I've been deeply involved in this space and the various experiments that government has had, both at precinct, project precinct, and things like the city deal. So, look, I think place is important, and some places are more important than others. And when we look at a region like the Hunter, which is Australia's largest regional economy, and I look it squarely in the face and say we will not achieve our national objectives to decarbonise our economy and the energy transition without a place like the Hunter. So they need us, and we're also of a sufficient scale and weight that actions and investments in a place like the Hunter can actually impact the state and the national economy. So there is a growing field within government experimenting in what's called place-based policies, because they do recognise the need for integration, but the complexity and how difficult that is to operationalise. So there's two ways that you can cut through that. Ring fence an area, reduce really the geographic scope, and then treat everything as complex and constant within that. Or it's really through the pathway of a person through various services. Another way that you can look across portfolios and silos and gear them together. I think I agree with Warwick. Well, I agree with everyone. We need a plan, and we need to set expectations of what is in that plan, what public service actually looks like, and that governments have a role in it. I just don't think that we should sit back and wait for that leadership to come, and I'll come back to that inertia inherent in the fragmentation of governance that we've got. So I think if we sat down and thought, where are we now? Where do we want to be? What's the gap? And what do we do to bridge that? We will find that there's probably a lot of things that we can do as a community, the not-for-profit sector, business, the private sector as well. There's things that we can do ourselves, but a big chunk of the stuff is going to require actions and investments and decisions across local, state and the federal government. So I think we need to aim to get there, and we know that that's possible because it is actually being done elsewhere. There's no doubt about that. Why cannot we have that here? However, I would also say, being on the other side of the fence, we can't assume that they actually know what to do, that the expertise is in there around structural adjustment or longer term regional development and these transformations. It just isn't. So I think that what we need to be doing right now is setting out the plan, the structures of it, the expectations of government, getting on with whatever we can. And then we have a document through which we can have far more pointed discussions with government on what, and different levels of government, on what we need from them to be doing, but we're not necessarily standing back waiting to do anything on account for them to produce a plan, which we would want an independent view of anyway, of its veracity and effectiveness.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. It's been great. The three topics for this event, for the first three events we've had this year, have been guided by a survey that we did with our members who wanted things like doing politics differently and priorities for the Hunter and changing energy mix. So we're following our members' views, but I think this has been a really important one. And we appreciate the time that you've given up in preparation and also presenting for tonight. To our members and to those people watching on Facebook, the next one, again, this was one of interest to our members, is about the world of economics, and there's a view that it's being turned on its head. The traditional economic theory is being turned on its head, and potentially the end of economic rationalism, or a change to the approach for economic rationalism. We've got three speakers on our panel next month in June. Bill Mitchell, many people will know of Bill. He's a professor at the Newcastle University and has a strong view on economic theory and the way it's used in government. Angela Jackson, who's been on one of our events last year, a nationally recognised economics commentator based in equity economics, and also George Pantelopoulos, who's a PhD student and economic academic in Newcastle, who'll be talking on the new approach to economics. So we welcome people to that event. We are trying to see if we can come back live, and maybe a combination of live and speakers from other places. So we'll update you on how we're going with getting a venue where we can do both. So once again, thank you for your time. Alice, Warwick and Gabriel. It's really great to have different perspectives, and we look forward to real opportunities and synergies between them in our region in the future. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Robin.
Thanks, Robin.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks.